January 4th, 1945. Kobi Airfield, Formosa. Lieutenant Charles Valentine August felt his F6F Hellcat shudder as the Pratt Whitney engine coughed, sputtered, then died completely. At 12,000 feet over enemy territory, he had perhaps 3 minutes to find a place to land before physics took over. Below him stretched Japanese-controlled island, every square mile crawling with enemy soldiers who would capture or kill him the moment he touched down. August had launched at 7:15 that morning from the light carrier USS Langley, leading the 2nd Division of Hellcats tasked with escorting 6 TBM Avengers on a strike against Kobi Airfield itself. The mission had been routine until his engine quit, no warning, no gradual loss of power, just sudden silence except for the wind rushing past his canopy. He'd been over the target area, had completed his strafing run on parked Japanese aircraft, when the fighter that had carried him faithfully through months of combat suddenly became a 7,000-pound glider with rapidly diminishing options. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. August brought the stricken Hellcat down in a controlled crash landing near the airfield. The impact was hard but survivable. He'd walked away from the aircraft with no serious injuries, but freedom lasted only minutes. Japanese soldiers appeared from multiple directions, rifles raised. August had no choice. Hands up, heart racing, he became a prisoner of war. His Hellcat, Bureau number 71,441, sat remarkably intact on Formosan soil, the first complete American carrier fighter of its type to fall into Japanese hands in operational condition. Within hours, Japanese technical intelligence personnel were swarming over August's abandoned fighter. They photographed every detail, they measured every component, they catalogued every system. Eventually, they transported the entire aircraft to Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal on the Japanese mainland, painted Japanese Hinomaru markings over the American stars, and assigned it the tail code Yo-801. What they discovered when they examined this single American fighter would confirm their worst fears about the technological and industrial gulf that had opened between Japan and the United States. But the story of what the Japanese learned from captured American technology begins not with a single Hellcat in January 1945, but with a systematic intelligence failure that stretched back to the beginning of the war, a failure that would cost Japan everything. The aircraft that August flew represented American industrial and technological superiority that Japanese engineers could barely comprehend. The Grumman F6F Hellcat that sat at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal was not just a fighter, it was evidence. Evidence of manufacturing capacity that dwarfed Japan's entire aviation industry. Evidence of design philosophy that prioritized pilot survival over every other consideration. Evidence of technological advancement in materials, engines, and systems that Japan could not hope to match. The intact Hellcat weighed 7,426 pounds, fully loaded. Japanese engineers, trained in precision measurement and technical analysis, went to work with calipers, micrometers, and careful documentation. What they found was simultaneously impressive and demoralizing. The airframe construction was robust beyond Japanese standards. American aluminum alloys were thicker, stronger, heavier than anything in Japanese inventory. The wing spars were massive solid pieces of forged aluminum designed to handle stresses that would have torn apart lighter Japanese designs. The fuselage structure incorporated redundant load paths, meaning damage to one structural member wouldn't compromise the entire aircraft. Japanese fighters like the Zero achieved their legendary maneuverability by eliminating such redundancy. Weight meant everything to Japanese designers. Safety meant nothing compared to performance. The Hellcat's engine represented a level of industrial capacity that stunned Japanese analysts. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double-wasp radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower from 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows. Japanese engines of similar displacement produced significantly less power. The metallurgy required to build engines capable of sustained high-power operation exceeded Japanese capabilities. American engines could run at maximum power for extended periods, without mechanical failure. Japanese engines required careful management to prevent catastrophic overheating or structural failure. But perhaps most telling was what Japanese engineers found protecting the Hellcat's pilot. Behind the seat sat an armor plate weighing approximately 40 pounds hardened steel nearly half an inch thick, positioned to shield the pilot's back and head from enemy fire. The windscreen incorporated armored glass, bulletproof and optically clear, providing protection without significantly compromising visibility. Additional armor protected vital components, including the oil cooler and portions of the engine. The cumulative weight of protection systems exceeded 250 pounds. Japanese fighters carried no such protection. Zero fighters, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, featured thin aluminum skin barely thicker than heavy paper, no pilot armor, no bulletproof windscreen, no protected fuel tanks. Every kilogram saved went into fuel capacity and maneuverability. Japanese design philosophy assumed that skilled pilots could avoid being hit. American design philosophy assumed pilots would be hit and needed to survive. The fuel system on August's Hellcat incorporated self-sealing tanks, layers of rubber, compound sandwiched between aluminum sheets that would swell when punctured, automatically sealing bullet holes and preventing fuel leakage. When Japanese engineers examined captured American self-sealing fuel tank samples, they understood immediately the sophistication required. The rubber compounds had to remain flexible across extreme temperature ranges, from tropical heat to high-altitude cold. They had to withstand prolonged contact with aviation fuel without deteriorating. They had to seal punctures from multiple calibers of ammunition while maintaining structural integrity. Japan had attempted to develop similar technology. Limited quantities of rubber reached Japanese aircraft, applied as external sheets beneath fuel tanks rather than integrated into tank construction. These crude attempts at protection added weight without providing reliable sealing. Japanese factories lacked the manufacturing capacity, the raw materials, and the specialized knowledge to produce effective self-sealing systems in quantity. The Hellcat's self-sealing tanks added approximately 150 pounds compared to unprotected Japanese fuel cells of similar capacity, but combat statistics demonstrated the value. American pilots whose aircraft were hit by enemy fire had significantly higher survival rates than Japanese pilots in comparable situations. Protected fuel systems meant American fighters could absorb battle damage and return home. Japanese fighters exploded when hit. Beyond armor and fuel protection, Japanese engineers examining the captured Hellcat discovered advanced systems throughout the aircraft. The hydraulic systems that operated landing gear, flaps, and other controls were more sophisticated than Japanese equivalents. The electrical systems incorporated redundancy and circuit protection absent from Japanese designs. The radio equipment was more powerful, more reliable, and more capable than anything Japan produced. Even the instruments in the cockpit altimeter, airspeed indicator, artificial horizon showed superior craftsmanship and reliability. The construction quality itself was remarkable. Rivets were perfectly formed, aluminum sheets were precisely cut and fitted, welds were clean and strong. American factories produced aircraft with consistent quality across thousands of examples. Japanese factories struggled to maintain quality standards as raw materials grew scarce and experienced workers were drafted into military service. By January 1945, when August's Hellcat arrived at Yokosuka, Japanese technical intelligence had examined multiple American aircraft types. They'd recovered crashed B-17 flying fortresses in the Philippines, examining their armament, their armor, their turbo superchargers that enabled high-altitude operations. They'd captured P-40 Warhawks in the Netherlands East Indies, studying their rugged construction and heavy armament. They'd examined crashed Corsairs, Avengers, Liberators, a catalogue of American aviation technology that consistently demonstrated superiority in protection, reliability, and manufacturing quality. Each captured aircraft told the same story. American industry could produce sophisticated aircraft in overwhelming quantities while maintaining high-quality standards. Japanese industry could produce limited numbers of increasingly obsolete aircraft with declining quality. The gap was unbridgeable. But there was one aspect of American technology that Japanese intelligence understood primarily through terrifying combat experience rather than through captured hardware. The radar that allowed American night fighters to hunt in total darkness, seeing their prey from miles away when visibility was zero. The night raids were what broke Japanese nerves. December 1944. Task Force 38 steamed off the Philippines, launching strikes against Japanese positions. After sunset, when darkness should have provided sanctuary, American fighters continued patrolling. Japanese aircraft attempting nighttime attacks against the fleet found themselves intercepted miles from their targets, shot down by unseen enemies who appeared out of blackness with devastating precision. Japanese pilots reported being attacked before they saw any American aircraft. One moment they were approaching the task force under cover of darkness. The next moment tracer rounds were ripping through their aircraft from an attacker they never saw coming. Survivors described a new kind of warfare where darkness provided no protection, where American fighters seemed to possess supernatural ability to detect and engage targets in conditions where visual contact was impossible. The Americans called it radar radio detection and ranging. Japanese engineers had developed their own radar technology, but Japanese airborne radar lagged far behind American capabilities in range, reliability, and effectiveness. Japanese radar development had started promisingly, but had been hampered by limited resources, inadequate electronic components, and insufficient priority in military procurement. The APS-6 radar that equipped American F6F Newton's night fighter Hellcats represented technological sophistication that Japanese engineers understood but could not replicate. The system weighed 242 pounds, including the radar pod mounted on the starboard wing, the display unit in the cockpit, and associated electronics. It operated at X-band frequency 10 GHz, using a cavity magnetron transmitter that produced short, powerful pulses of microwave energy. The parabolic antenna in the wing pod rotated at 1200 revolutions per minute, while simultaneously nodding through 60 degrees in each direction, creating a spiral scan pattern that covered a 120-degree cone ahead of the aircraft. The system could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 5 miles in optimal conditions, though effective. Detection range varied with target size, altitude, weather conditions, and operator skill. The cockpit display showed target bearing, range, and relative altitude through an ingenious double-dot system. The left dot represented the target's position, while the right dot's position relative to the left indicated whether the target was above or below the fighter. A pilot could track a target through darkness, close to weapons range, and engage without ever seeing the enemy visually until gunfire illuminated both aircraft. The system included multiple operating modes. Long-range search at 25 or 65 miles allowed detection of large formations or individual aircraft at extreme distances. Medium-range search at 5 miles provided tactical information for intercepts. Short-range gunsight mode at 1,000 yards assisted final approach and weapons delivery. The radar could also receive beacon signals from carriers, allowing pilots to navigate home through darkness and poor weather. Japanese night fighters carried primitive radar when they carried any at all. The FD-2 night fighter radar, developed for installation in Japanese twin-engine fighters, weighed 70 kilograms, comparable to American systems, but performed far less effectively. Detection range was limited to approximately 3 kilometers against aircraft targets. The display was crude. The system was unreliable. Japanese pilots who flew with airborne radar complained about its limitations, and many preferred to rely on visual searching and ground-based searchlights. More fundamentally, Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce sophisticated radar systems in quantity. Vacuum tube manufacturing could not meet demand. Critical electronic components were in short supply. The raw materials needed for high-frequency radar specialized metals, insulating materials, precision mechanical components, were simply unavailable in sufficient quantities. Even when Japanese engineers designed capable radar systems, Japanese factories couldn't build them in militarily significant numbers. The captured Hellcat at Yokosuka almost certainly was not a night fighter variant. Bureau number 71441 was a standard F6F equipped with 650 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying bombs or rockets, but lacking the distinctive radar pod on the wing. Japanese intelligence reports from the examination focused on airframe construction, engine design, armament, and protection systems, not on radar equipment that wasn't present. But Japanese forces knew about American night fighting capabilities. They experienced them nightly. They lost aircraft to radar-equipped American fighters, operating in conditions where combat should have been impossible. They understood that American technological superiority extended to electronic warfare, to systems that allowed Americans to fight when Japanese pilots were essentially blind. The reality Japanese engineers confronted at Yokosuka was more devastating than any single technological shortcoming. The captured Hellcat represented not just superior engineering, but impossible to match industrial capacity. By January 1945, Grumman had produced over 12,000 Hellcats in just over 2 years. 11,000 of those fighters had been built in a 24-month period, an average of more than 450 aircraft per month from a single manufacturer. Japan's entire aviation industry, combining all manufacturers across all aircraft types, struggled to produce that many aircraft total per month by late 1944, and Japanese production was declining as American bombing intensified, as raw materials grew scarce, as factory workers were conscripted, as supply chains collapsed. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. American industry could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. American pilots shot down could be replaced within months with well-trained replacements. American aircraft destroyed in combat were replaced within weeks. Japanese pilots lost in combat represented years of training that could never be recovered. Japanese aircraft destroyed could not be replaced at rates necessary to maintain strength. Lieutenant Toyoda Takago worked at the Naval Air Technical Research Arsenal at Yokosuka during the final years of the war. Years later, he described the systematic examination of captured American aircraft with a mixture of professional admiration and personal despair. American construction was extremely strong, he noted. The weight of protection systems amazed Japanese engineers who had spent their entire careers obsessing over every gram saved. The quality of materials exceeded anything available to Japanese industry. The sophistication of systems integration demonstrated manufacturing capabilities Japan could not hope to achieve. But beyond technical specifications, what struck Japanese analysts most profoundly was the philosophy. American aircraft were designed to bring pilots home alive. Japanese aircraft were designed to reach targets regardless of cost. These two approaches defined everything construction: protection, doctrine, training, operational employment. When Japanese engineers examined the armor plate behind the Hellcat's pilot seat, they understood its implications. That 40 pounds of hardened steel could stop rifle-caliber bullets and shell fragments that would otherwise kill or incapacitate the pilot. An American pilot hit from behind had reasonable chances of survival. A Japanese pilot in a zero hit from behind was dead or crippled. When they examined the self-sealing fuel tanks, they understood that American pilots whose aircraft were damaged by enemy fire had significantly higher probabilities of returning to base. Punctured fuel tanks would seal automatically, preventing fuel loss and catastrophic fires. Japanese pilots whose fuel tanks were hit almost inevitably died in flames. The cumulative effect of these protection systems was staggering. American pilot survival rates in aircraft that sustained battle damage were multiple times higher than Japanese survival rates in comparable situations. This meant American pilots gained combat experience, learned from mistakes, developed skills that made them progressively more dangerous. Japanese pilots died before accumulating significant experience, forcing Japan to send increasingly inexperienced replacements against increasingly experienced American opponents. By December 1944, the average American Navy fighter pilot had over 300 hours of flight training before reaching combat squadrons. Japanese pilot training had collapsed to 100 hours or less. American pilots practiced aerial gunnery extensively, burning through thousands of rounds of ammunition in training. Japanese pilots received minimal gunnery training due to ammunition shortages. American pilots learned tactics against instructors who had survived combat. Japanese pilots learned from instructors who had never seen combat or from combat veterans too valuable to risk in training roles. The captured Hellcat represented all of these advantages crystallized in aluminum and steel. But there was one American capability that particularly terrified Japanese forces: the ability to hunt and kill in complete darkness, guided by electronic eyes that saw through night and weather. The night fighters were everywhere. March 1945, Okinawa. Japanese forces prepared for the American invasion they knew was coming. After sunset, Japanese aircraft attempted to move reinforcements, supplies, and reconnaissance aircraft under cover of darkness. American radar-equipped fighters intercepted them with disturbing regularity. Lieutenant Commander William Henry, flying an F6F Newton's night fighter from the carrier Independence, was vectored toward a Japanese bomber by the ship's radar. The fighter director officer aboard Independence could see the enemy aircraft on radar screens, could calculate intercept courses, could guide the night fighter to within miles of the target. Then Henry's own airborne radar took over. The APS-6 display showed the target as a bright dot on the scope, range decreasing as Henry closed from behind and below. 3 miles, 2 miles. The bomber pilot had no idea an American fighter was stalking him in the darkness. No visual contact was possible in the moonless night. Henry closed to 1 mile, still invisible to his prey, still tracking the target on radar. At half a mile, he switched the radar to gunsight mode and began his final approach, using the radar display to aim his aircraft. At 1,000 yards, Henry could finally see the Japanese bomber silhouetted against the lighter sky above. It was a G4M Betty, the same type of bomber that had terrorized Allied forces in the early war, now completely vulnerable to technology it could not counter. Henry fired a short burst from his 650 caliber machine guns. The Betty exploded in flames and fell into the ocean. Total time from radar contact to destruction, 4 minutes. The Japanese bomber crew never knew what killed them. This scene repeated hundreds of times across the Pacific in late 1944 and early 1945. American night fighters, guided by ship-based radar and equipped with their own airborne radar, hunted Japanese aircraft with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese called these American fighters electric eye aircraft. Japanese pilots reported that darkness no longer provided protection, that American fighters could apparently see through the night itself. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. Marine Fighting Squadron 541, equipped with F6F Newton's night fighters, arrived at Tacloban in the Philippines on December 3, 1944. The squadron's primary mission was providing dawn and dusk combat air patrol, the vulnerable periods when Japanese aircraft tried to exploit the transition between night and day. But the Marines quickly demonstrated their night fighting capabilities as well. On December 5th, just 2 nights after arriving, Lieutenant R.E. Montgomery intercepted and destroyed a Japanese Oscar fighter in complete darkness using his radar. 2 more Japanese aircraft were shot down the following night. By January 3, 1945, just 32 days after arrival, the squadron had destroyed 22 Japanese aircraft while losing none of their own Hellcats to enemy action. The success of Marine Night Fighting Squadron 541 demonstrated what radar-equipped fighters could achieve. American pilots could patrol in darkness, could detect enemy aircraft before the enemy detected them, could maneuver into attack position while remaining invisible, could engage and destroy targets that had no defense because they couldn't see their attackers. VF-76, one of the first Navy night fighter squadrons, became the highest-scoring night fighter unit of the war. One detachment from the squadron shot down 26 Japanese aircraft, virtually all in darkness or low visibility conditions, where visual combat would have been impossible. The squadron's success rate was extraordinary. Most missions that resulted in radar contact ended with destroyed enemy aircraft. The technological advantage was overwhelming. Japanese pilots attempting night operations faced opponents who could see them electronically while remaining invisible themselves. It was like fighting an opponent who could see in the dark while you were blind. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese pilots knew that any night mission might end with sudden death from an unseen attacker. There was no defense, no countermeasure, no tactic that worked. Japanese forces had their own radar, but the technology gap was insurmountable. Ground-based Japanese radar could detect approaching American formations, but lacked the precision and reliability of American systems. Japanese radar operators struggled with equipment that frequently malfunctioned, that provided imprecise information, that couldn't track multiple targets effectively. Japanese airborne radar was even more limited. The H-6 radar installed on some G-4M Betty bombers operated at 2-meter wavelength and could detect surface ships, but was essentially useless for air-to-air combat. The FD-2 night fighter radar theoretically could detect aircraft at 3 kilometers, but in practice, the range was far shorter, the display was difficult to interpret, and the system was unreliable. More fundamentally, Japan lacked the integrated air defense system that made American radar so effective. American task forces operated with combat information centers that processed radar data from multiple ships, calculated intercept courses, and vectored fighters with precision. Fighter directors aboard American carriers were trained specialists who understood radar limitations and fighter capabilities, who could guide pilots to intercepts, even when the pilots themselves couldn't yet see the targets on their own radar. Japan had no equivalent capability. Japanese radar stations operated independently with poor coordination. Information sharing between services was limited by institutional rivalry. Army and Navy didn't cooperate effectively even when facing common threats. Japanese fighter direction was primitive compared to American systems, relying primarily on visual sighting and radio reports rather than radar-guided intercepts. The captured Hellcat at Yokosuka couldn't explain these systemic failures. The aircraft itself didn't carry night fighter radar equipment, but Japanese intelligence had plenty of other evidence about American radar capabilities. They'd captured American radar equipment from crashed aircraft. They'd interrogated American prisoners who described radar-guided intercepts. They'd intercepted American radio communications between fighter directors and pilots. They'd experienced firsthand the results Japanese aircraft being shot down in conditions where visual combat should have been impossible. What Japanese engineers learned from examining the Hellcat and other captured American aircraft was that the technological and industrial gap had grown too wide to bridge. American advantages weren't limited to single systems or individual technologies. Every aspect of American aviation showed superior capabilities: engines, materials, manufacturing, systems integration, protection, reliability. The engines particularly demonstrated the gap. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp in August's Hellcat produced 2,000 horsepower reliably, continuously, in combat conditions. Japanese engines of similar displacement produced significantly less power and required careful management to prevent failure. American metallurgy, American manufacturing tolerances, American quality control all exceeded Japanese capabilities. Japanese engineers understood why American engines performed better. They understood the metallurgical processes, the manufacturing techniques, the quality control systems required. Understanding didn't help. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, the raw materials, the manufacturing equipment, and the skilled workforce to implement what they understood theoretically. The aluminum alloys in American aircraft were superior to Japanese equivalents. American factories could produce high-strength aluminum in quantity. Japanese factories struggled to produce adequate quantities of standard aluminum, much less advanced alloys. By late 1944, Japanese aircraft manufacturers were substituting wood for aluminum in some applications due to material shortages. The hydraulic systems, electrical systems, and mechanical systems throughout American aircraft showed better design and superior components compared to Japanese equivalents. American manufacturers had access to rubber, copper, specialized steels, and other materials that were in critically short supply in Japan. American factories could maintain quality standards across thousands of aircraft. Japanese factories saw quality decline as experienced workers left and substitute materials replaced standard components. Even basic construction reflected the industrial gap. American aircraft used consistent riveting techniques, precise metal forming, and quality welds. Japanese aircraft showed increasingly variable construction quality as the war progressed. Factory workers who had built aircraft for years were conscripted into military service. Replacement workers lacked experience. Substitute materials behaved differently than standard materials. Quality control systems broke down under pressure to maximize production numbers. The captured Hellcat's radio equipment demonstrated another American advantage. The radio was more powerful than Japanese equivalents, broadcast on more frequencies, included identification friend or foe, IFF, transponders that worked reliably, and was built to higher quality standards. American pilots could communicate clearly with other aircraft and with ships across greater distances than Japanese pilots. Communication superiority provided tactical advantages in every engagement. Japanese forces had developed their own IFF systems, but characteristically, the Army and Navy had developed separate, incompatible systems. Japanese Army aircraft couldn't be identified by Japanese Navy radar and vice versa. This absurd situation resulted from institutional rivalry that persisted even as Japan faced defeat. American forces had unified IFF systems that worked across all services. Every American aircraft could be identified by any American radar as friendly. The examination of August's Hellcat took place while American B-29 superfortresses were systematically destroying Japanese cities. The same industrial capacity that produced 12,000 Hellcats in 2 years also produced thousands of B-29 seconds, the most sophisticated bomber in the world, capable of flying at altitudes Japanese fighters couldn't reach effectively, carrying bomb loads that dwarfed anything Japanese bombers could deliver. By March 1945, American bombing had moved from military targets to systematic destruction of Japanese urban areas. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Japan's major cities burned in firestorms created by American incendiary bombs. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians died. Japanese fighter defenses could not stop the B-29 seconds. Japanese industry could not replace destroyed factories. Japanese will to continue fighting eroded as the reality of defeat became undeniable. The captured Hellcat at Yokosuka represented all of this. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was evidence of industrial capacity Japan could never match, technological sophistication Japan couldn't replicate, design philosophy that prioritized human life in ways Japanese culture and military doctrine rejected, and systematic advantages that accumulated into overwhelming superiority. Japanese technical intelligence personnel, who examined captured American aircraft, understood what they were seeing. They wrote detailed reports describing American construction techniques, material specifications, system designs, and manufacturing quality. These reports circulated through Japanese military and industrial hierarchies. Everyone who read them understood the implications. Japan could not win a prolonged war against an opponent with such enormous industrial and technological advantages. Japanese aircraft designers could not close the gap in performance. Japanese factories could not match American production quantities. Japanese doctrine could not compensate for American material superiority. The war was lost. It had been lost from the moment it began, lost by the fundamental miscalculation that will and spirit could overcome industrial capacity. The captured Hellcat sat at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, a trophy that was actually evidence of defeat. Japanese engineers photographed every detail, measured every component, analyzed every system. What could they do with this information? Nothing. Understanding American superiority didn't provide any way to match it. By April 1945, American forces were preparing to invade Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. Japanese forces defended desperately, employing kamikaze tactics that traded pilots' lives for individual American ships. Even this last desperate strategy couldn't stop the American advance. American ships absorbed kamikaze hits, repaired the damage, and returned to action. Japanese pilots died by the thousands, achieving tactical results that meant nothing strategically. The night fighters continued, hunting through darkness. American radar-equipped fighters patrolled over Okinawa and surrounding waters, shooting down Japanese aircraft that tried to attack the invasion fleet. Japanese kamikaze pilots faced not just overwhelming American fighter strength during daylight, but radar-guided interceptors at night. There was no time when American forces were vulnerable, no conditions that gave Japanese forces advantage. Captain Robert Baird, flying an F6F Newtons with Marine Night Fighting Squadron 533, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft over Okinawa, all at night using his radar. He became the only Marine night fighter ace of the war, and the only Marine Hellcat ace. His victories came on the nights of June 9th, June 16th, June 22nd, and July 13th, each one representing a Japanese aircraft and crew destroyed by an opponent they never saw, never had any chance of defending against. Baird's success was not exceptional among night fighter pilots. Dozens of American pilots achieved multiple night victories. The pattern was consistent radar contact, guided intercept, visual acquisition at short range, brief gunfire, enemy aircraft destroyed. Japanese pilots had no defense, no countermeasure, no tactic that worked. They died in darkness, shot down by enemies they couldn't see. The technological revolution that radar represented extended beyond individual capabilities. American forces integrated radar into comprehensive systems. Ship-based search radar detected threats at long range. Fighter direction officers calculated intercepts. Airborne radar in fighters provided terminal guidance. IFF prevented friendly fire. Beacon systems guided pilots home. Every element worked together as a system, each component enhancing the others. Japan had developed individual radar technologies but never created the integrated systems that made radar decisively effective. Japanese radar stations operated independently. Japanese fighter direction was primitive. Japanese radar equipment was unreliable. Japanese doctrine hadn't fully incorporated radar into operational planning. The technological gap was compounded by systematic failures that made Japanese radar far less effective than its specifications suggested. By August 1945, Japan faced not just defeat but annihilation. American submarines had strangled maritime commerce. American bombing had destroyed urban areas and industrial capacity. American forces had seized island after island, establishing bases ever closer to Japan. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th, attacking Japanese forces in Manchuria with overwhelming strength. Japan had lost the ability to continue fighting effectively. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast heard across the empire. The war was over. Japan had lost everything empire: military strength, industrial capacity, and over 3 million dead, including hundreds of thousands of civilians killed by American bombing. The captured Hellcat at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal had revealed truths that Japanese leadership already understood by January 1945. American technological and industrial superiority was overwhelming. Japanese advantages in pilot quality and combat experience from the early war had been eroded by attrition. American material strength was unlimited compared to Japanese resources. Victory was impossible. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces surveyed, captured Japanese aircraft and equipment. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, they found August's Hellcat with Japanese markings painted over the American insignia, tail code Yo-801 crudely applied with visible paint drips. The aircraft was damaged, pushed into a grass dispersal area alongside Japanese aircraft. American personnel photographed it as a curiosity, an American fighter in Japanese colors. Evidence of Japan's desperate attempts to understand the technology that was destroying them. Lieutenant Charles Valentine August survived his captivity as a prisoner of war. He was held at a POW camp near Tokyo for 7 months, enduring brutal conditions and inadequate food. American forces liberated him in August 1945 after Japan's surrender. He returned to the United States and resumed his naval career, eventually retiring as a commander. Remarkably, August had been a prisoner of war twice during World War II. He'd been captured by Vichy French forces when shot down during Operation Torch in November 1942, held briefly, then repatriated when the French switched sides. His second capture in January 1945 was far worse. Japanese treatment of prisoners was harsh. Many American prisoners died from maltreatment, starvation, or deliberate execution. August's survival was fortunate. The story of the captured Hellcat and what Japanese engineers learned from examining American aircraft illuminates a larger truth about World War II in the Pacific. Technological superiority alone didn't determine outcomes. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was won primarily through intelligence and tactical decisions, rather than technological advantages. But by 1944 and 1945, accumulated American advantages in technology, industrial production, pilot training, and operational doctrine had created conditions where Japanese forces could not achieve victory, regardless of courage, skill, or sacrifice. The radar-equipped night fighters represented one aspect of this overwhelming superiority. American forces could fight effectively in conditions where Japanese forces were blind, but radar was just one system among many. American advantages extended across every dimension of air combat aircraft performance: engine reliability, protection systems, armament, manufacturing quality, maintenance support, pilot training, tactical doctrine, and operational employment. Japanese engineers who examined captured American aircraft understood what they were seeing. They wrote reports documenting American advantages. Those reports circulated through Japanese military bureaucracy, but understanding the problem didn't provide solutions. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to match American production. Japan lacked the raw materials to build aircraft in necessary quantities. Japan lacked the technological base to close performance gaps. Japan lacked the time to develop new capabilities before American forces completed their conquest. The fundamental question the captured Hellcat answered was not whether Japanese engineers could understand American technology. They could. The question was whether Japan could replicate American capabilities. It couldn't. The industrial and technological gap was too wide. American advantages were too comprehensive. Japanese resources were too limited. By January 1945, when August's Hellcat arrived at Yokosuka, the pre-says war's outcome was decided. Japan would fight on for 7 more months, sacrificing tens of thousands more lives in campaigns that couldn't change the strategic situation. But defeat was inevitable. American technological and industrial superiority, combined with doctrinal evolution that learned from early mistakes, had created conditions where Japanese forces could not win regardless of determination. The captured Hellcat sat at Yokosuka as a monument to these truths, a well-engineered, heavily protected, thoroughly modern fighter aircraft that represented everything Japan could not match. Japanese engineers could measure every dimension, photograph every detail, analyze every system. Understanding didn't help. The gap was unbridgeable, and in the night skies over the Pacific, American fighters equipped with radar continued hunting Japanese aircraft in complete darkness, destroying them before they knew death was coming. The electronic eyes that saw through night and weather gave American forces capabilities that seemed supernatural to opponents who had no countermeasure. The technological revolution that radar represented had changed warfare fundamentally. Japan understood this. Understanding didn't help. The Americans could see in the dark, the Japanese could not, and that made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.